I'm Gail Adams, and there's something I need to tell you about the day my father died, something that's haunted me for over 70 years. I was 8 years old when I watched my grandfather Walter laugh at my father's funeral. Actually laugh, while my mother wept into her black scarf and my 5-year-old brother Ethan clung to her dress, asking why Papa wouldn't wake up. That laugh still echoes in my mind because it was the sound of a man who had just gotten exactly what he wanted. You see, my father Victor had been planning to leave town, to take us away from Walter's control and start fresh somewhere new, but he never got that chance. Within hours of the funeral, Walter was already moving, already planning, already circling like a vulture around everything my father had built. The small businesses, the insurance money, the property that was meant to keep us safe. What I witnessed over the next few years wasn't just greed. It was a calculated destruction of a widow and her children by the very people who were supposed to love and protect us. My grandfather, my grandmother Agnes, my uncle Leonard and his wife Beatrice, they didn't just steal our money, they stole our childhood, our security, our faith in family itself. They forced my grieving mother into signing papers she couldn't understand, then threw us out of our home and watched us struggle in poverty while they lived like kings on what should have been ours. But here's what they didn't count on. They didn't count on my mother's strength, her refusal to let them win, and her decision to fight back through the courts in a legal battle that would consume nearly a decade of our lives and reveal just how far people will go to keep what they've stolen. When I was just 8 years old, my world collapsed in a single afternoon. My father Victor died suddenly, and even now, decades later, the questions still burn in my chest. Was it his mistress who found him first? Was someone in our own family involved? The adults whispered in corners, their voices dropping whenever Ethan or I walked into a room, and we never got real answers, just fragments of hushed conversations that made no sense to a child's mind. My little brother Ethan was only 5 then, and I can still see him gripping Mama Lila's hand so tightly his knuckles went white, asking over and over why Papa wouldn't come home for dinner. I was the older one, the one who was supposed to understand things, but I felt just as lost and confused as he did. Papa wasn't a perfect man. He'd had an affair that wounded my mom so deeply she'd cry quietly in the kitchen when she thought we weren't looking. But he was our foundation, our safe place in a family that always felt like it was walking on thin ice. The tension between Papa and my grandfather Walter had been building for years. They'd argue about money, about business decisions, about the way Papa wanted to raise us kids. Papa had dreams of taking us away from all of it, of finding a place where we could live without Walter's constant interference and judgment. He'd talk about it sometimes, his voice getting softer when he described a little house somewhere far from here, where my mom could have her own garden and Ethan and I could play without feeling like we were always being watched and criticized. That funeral still haunts me. The air in that small church felt heavy, not with grief but with something else, something that made my skin crawl even though I couldn't name it. While my mom sobbed and neighbors offered their condolences, I kept watching the faces around me, trying to understand why some people looked genuinely sad while others seemed almost relieved. Even at 8, I knew something was terribly wrong with the whole situation. If you can, please leave in the comments where you're watching this old lady from. It warms my heart to know that my voice is reaching far, maybe even places I never had the chance to visit. And if you like my story, please leave a like and subscribe to Grandparents Archives. That funeral will follow me to my grave. I remember every detail, the way my mom's tears soaked through her black scarf until the fabric clung to her cheeks, the smell of too many flowers trying to mask something rotten, and most of all, Walter's face. My grandfather stood there actually smiling, sometimes letting out these quiet chuckles when he thought no one was watching. Other mourners would pat his shoulder, thinking he was being strong for the family, but I saw something else entirely. Even as an 8-year-old, I recognized the look of a man who had just won something he'd been waiting for. Walter had always made it crystal clear that Leonard, my uncle, was his golden child. Leonard could do no wrong in Walter's eyes. He was the smart one, the responsible one, the son who would carry on the family name properly. Papa, on the other hand, was treated like a disappointment, a burden that Walter had to tolerate. Every family dinner was a minefield where Walter would praise Leonard's latest accomplishment while finding fault with everything Papa did. I used to watch Papa's jaw tighten during those meals, The way his hands would clench around his fork when Walter would make his cutting remarks about Papa's small-minded business ventures or his inability to think bigger. The moment Papa was in the ground, everything changed. Walter, Agnes, Leonard, and his wife Beatrice moved like they'd been planning this for years. Papa had worked so hard to build his little businesses. Nothing fancy, just steady income streams that kept food on our table and clothes on our backs. He'd saved money, took out insurance policies, made sure that if anything happened to him, my mom would be able to take care of Ethan and me without having to depend on anyone. He knew how Walter operated, knew that independence was the only protection we'd have. But grief does terrible things to your judgment, and my mom was drowning in it. Walter came to our house just 3 days after the funeral, bringing stacks of papers and speaking in that authoritative voice he used when he wanted people to obey without question. Agnes stood behind him, nodding along to everything he said, while Leonard and Beatrice lingered by the door like they were ready to block any escape route. I was hiding on the stairs, listening to every word, watching through the banister rails as Walter spread documents across our kitchen table. "Lila, you can't possibly manage Victor's affairs on your own," Walter kept saying, his voice dripping with false concern. "You don't understand business. You don't know about investments or property management. Sign these papers and let us handle everything properly. We'll make sure you and the children are taken care of." My mom kept shaking her head, saying she needed time to think, time to understand what she was signing, but Walter wouldn't let up. He'd lean closer, his voice getting harder, reminding her that she had 2 young children to think about, that she couldn't afford to make mistakes with our future at stake. Agnes would chime in with comments about how complicated these things were, how my mom shouldn't burden herself with such difficult decisions while she was still grieving. I watched my mother's hands tremble as she held those papers. Her wedding ring caught the light from our kitchen window, and I could see her trying to read through the legal language while tears kept blurring her vision. Walter stood over her the entire time, his shadow falling across the documents, making it impossible for her to concentrate. Every time she'd start to ask a question or express doubt, he'd interrupt with more pressure, more urgency about getting things settled properly. When my mom finally signed those papers, I saw something break in her face. It was like watching someone give up a piece of their soul, and even at 8 years old, I knew we'd just lost everything that mattered. Walter gathered up the documents with satisfaction, promising again that everything would be handled appropriately, while Agnes patted my mom's shoulder with fake sympathy. Within weeks, they'd taken control of Papa's businesses, claimed the insurance money, and started the process of forcing us out of our home. The businesses that Papa had built from nothing were suddenly family assets that needed to be managed by people with experience. The insurance money that was supposed to keep us secure became estate funds that Walter would invest wisely for everyone's benefit. Our house, the only home Ethan and I had ever known, was suddenly too expensive for a widow to maintain. They cast us out like we were strangers who'd overstayed their welcome. One day we belonged to this family. The next day we were packing our few remaining possessions into cardboard boxes and moving to a tiny apartment across town that smelled like mold and had windows that wouldn't close properly. I remember carrying Ethan's stuffed animals in a paper bag because we didn't have enough suitcases for everything, and he kept asking me why we couldn't take his bed, why we had to leave his toys behind. Those first months in that cramped apartment were the hardest of my childhood. My mom would cry herself to sleep every night, thinking Ethan and I couldn't hear her through the thin walls. But we heard everything, her prayers, her sobs, her whispered apologies to Papa for not being strong enough to protect what he'd built for us. I'd lie awake listening to her pain and feeling this rage building in my chest that I was too young to understand or express. During the day, my mom would try to hold herself together for us. She'd make breakfast from whatever food we had, help us get ready for school, smile when we told her about our day. But I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped when she thought we weren't looking. She took whatever work she could find, cleaning houses, taking in sewing, anything that would bring in a few dollars, while Walter and his family continued living in comfort off what should have been ours. The cruelest blow came about a year later. Walter and Agnes decided that my mom needed to remarry, that it wasn't appropriate for a young woman to remain single with 2 children to raise. They'd already picked out her husband, A man named Roger who worked at the bank and had been looking for a wife. They presented it to my mom like it was a generous solution to her problems, a way to provide stability for Ethan and me. Roger's house felt like a prison from the moment we moved in. He made it clear that we were there on sufferance, that my mom was lucky he was willing to take on someone else's children. His voice was always harsh when he spoke to us, his rules were arbitrary and cruel, and his patience with childhood noise or mistakes was non-existent. My mom did her best to shield us from the worst of it, but I could see what the situation was costing her. She'd lost weight, her smile had become this forced, brittle thing, and she jumped at sudden noises like she was always expecting something bad to happen. Ethan, who had been such a happy, chattering little boy, became quiet and withdrawn. He'd ask me questions that broke my heart. Why doesn't Grandpa love us anymore? Why did we have to leave our real house? When is Papa coming back? I was 12 years old by then, trying to be the strong older sister, but I had no answers that would make sense to a 7-year-old. How do you explain to a child that the people who should love and protect you are the same ones who destroyed your family? I'd lie in bed in that cold house, listening to Roger's harsh voice berating my mom for some imagined slight, and I'd make promises to myself. I promised that someday I'd be old enough to understand what had really happened to us. I promised that someday I'd find a way to get back what they'd stolen. Most of all, I promised that I'd never let anyone treat my family the way Walter and his clan had treated us. Those promises kept me going through the darkest years of my childhood, even when it felt like the whole world had turned against us. When I turned 16, something shifted in my mom. I remember the exact moment. We were sitting at Roger's kitchen table, and she was going through Papa's old papers that she'd managed to save, documents she'd hidden away for years. Her finger traced over his signature on an insurance policy, and suddenly her back straightened, her jaw set in a way I hadn't seen since before Papa died. She looked up at me with fire in her eyes and said, "Gail, we're going to fight back. We're going to get what's rightfully ours." That decision changed everything. My mom had spent 8 years being pushed around, told what to do, made to feel small and helpless, but somewhere deep inside, the woman Papa had married was still there. She started researching, asking questions, talking to people who might know about legal options. It took her months to save up enough money just to consult with a lawyer, working extra hours at the diner and skipping meals to put aside every dollar she could. I'll never forget walking into that first lawyer's office with her. My mom wore her best dress, the navy blue one she'd saved from before our world fell apart, and she carried a manila folder stuffed with every document she could find. Her hands shook as she told our story to Mr. Henderson, this older attorney who listened with a serious expression and took notes on a yellow legal pad. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and said the words that gave us hope for the first time in years. "Mrs. Roger, I believe you have grounds for a fraud case." Filing that lawsuit felt like declaring war. We knew Walter and his family would fight back hard, but my mom was determined. She'd spent too many years watching them live off what Papa had built, too many years accepting their version of events. "They stole from us when I was too broken to think straight," she told me. But I'm not broken anymore. The legal battle that followed was unlike anything I could have imagined. What should have been a straightforward case, proving that Walter had manipulated a grieving widow into signing away her husband's assets, turned into a maze of delays, postponements, and procedural roadblocks that seemed designed to wear us down. Every time we thought we were making progress, Walter's lawyer would find some new way to stall the proceedings. That lawyer, Mr. Cromwell, was a piece of work. He was this tall, thin man who always wore expensive suits and carried himself like he owned whatever room he walked into. He had this way of speaking that made everything sound reasonable and proper, even when he was doing the most underhanded things. He'd show up to hearings with stacks of motions and objections, each one more creative than the last, all designed to push our case further down the calendar. I started attending every court session once I turned 17. I'd sit behind my mom in those hard wooden benches, watching the proceedings and trying to understand the legal language that seemed designed to confuse regular people. What struck me most was the pattern. Every time our case was called, Cromwell would stand up with some new delay tactic. He'd request additional time to review documents, claim he needed expert witnesses, or argue that certain evidence couldn't be admitted for technical reasons I couldn't follow. The most frustrating part was watching the judges go along with it. They'd sigh and shake their heads like they were annoyed by the delays, but they'd grant Cromwell's requests anyway. One judge actually said from the bench, "Mr. Cromwell, this case has been on my calendar for 6 months. When will you be ready to proceed?" But when Cromwell launched into another explanation about needing more time, the judge just scheduled another continuance. Meanwhile, we were bleeding money we didn't have. Every court appearance meant my mom had to take time off work. Every legal brief cost more in attorney fees. Every postponement stretched our resources thinner. I watched my mom count and recount the money in her purse before each trip to the courthouse, her face getting more drawn and worried as the expenses piled up. Then came the first betrayal that really opened my eyes to how this game was played. Mr. Henderson, our original lawyer, started missing meetings and returning phone calls days late. His secretary would give us excuses about how busy he was, but I could hear something different in her voice. One afternoon, my mom went to his office unannounced and found it empty, not just vacant, but cleaned out like he'd never been there at all. It took us weeks to track him down and discover the truth. Henderson had taken money from Walter, a lot of money, to abandon our case right when it looked like we might actually win. He'd been feeding information about our legal strategy directly to Cromwell, telling them exactly how we planned to prove our case so they could prepare counterarguments in advance. When my mom confronted him, he didn't even have the decency to deny it. He just shrugged and said business was business, like selling out a widow and her children was just another day at the office. Finding a new lawyer meant starting over from scratch. Our second attorney, Mrs. Patterson, seemed more trustworthy at first. She was a woman, which made my mom feel more comfortable, and she expressed genuine outrage when we told her what Henderson had done. She dove into our case with energy, reorganizing all our evidence and developing what she called a bulletproof strategy to prove the fraud. For 6 months, Mrs. Patterson worked hard on our behalf. She filed motions, took depositions, and actually seemed to be making progress. I started to believe we might really win, that justice might actually exist for people like us. Then just 2 weeks before our trial date, Mrs. Patterson called my mom with devastating news. She was withdrawing from our case due to what she called ethical conflicts that had just come to light. Later, we learned the real story from her secretary, who felt guilty about what had happened. Walter had offered Mrs. Patterson a position at a much larger law firm, one that represented several of his business interests. The offer came with a signing bonus that was 3 times what we were paying her, plus the promise of ongoing work that would make her career. All she had to do was drop our case and turn over our files to help Walter's defense team. By the time we found our third lawyer, Mr. Torres, I was 18 years old and furious at the entire legal system. Torres was younger than our previous attorneys, hungrier, and he promised us that he wouldn't be bought off like the others. He seemed sincere when he told us that our case was exactly the kind of injustice that had made him want to become a lawyer in the first place. But the delays continued. Cromwell had perfected his stalling tactics by then, and he used every trick in the book to keep our case from reaching trial. He'd file last-minute motions that required weeks to respond to, request documents that had to be obtained from multiple sources, and challenge the admissibility of evidence on grounds so technical that even Torres had trouble explaining them to us. What made it worse was seeing how Walter and his family lived during all of this. While we were scraping together money for legal fees and my mom was working double shifts just to keep us afloat, they were living like royalty. Leonard had bought a new car, a shiny black sedan that he'd park right in front of the courthouse on the rare occasions when he bothered to show up for hearings. Beatrice would come to court wearing different expensive jewelry each time, like she was attending a social event instead of a legal proceeding about money they'd stolen from orphan children. Agnes, my grandmother who I'd once thought loved us, had taken up traveling. She'd send postcards from places like Singapore, Hawaii, and Europe, addressed to the family, like we were all still one big happy group. The postcards would show up at Roger's house, and he'd leave them on the kitchen counter where we couldn't avoid seeing them. "Having a wonderful time," Agnes would write. "The hotel is magnificent and the shopping is incredible." Each postcard was like a slap in the face, a reminder of exactly where our stolen money was going. The most painful part was that none of them ever actually appeared in court. Walter would send Cromwell to handle everything while he stayed home or traveled or conducted business as usual. When the judge would ask about Walter's absence, Cromwell always had an excuse ready: business trips, family emergencies, health issues that were never quite serious enough to require postponing the case, just serious enough to justify his client's absence. I'd sit in those courtroom benches, watching Cromwell shuffle through his papers and file yet another motion for delay, and I'd think about Walter somewhere else entirely, probably laughing with Leonard and Beatrice about how they were running circles around us. They knew that every month they could delay the case was another month of us struggling financially, another month closer to us giving up entirely. Ethan, who was 15 by then, had grown quiet in a way that worried me. He'd stopped asking questions about the case, stopped showing interest in whether we'd win or lose. When I'd try to talk to him about it, he'd just shrug and say it didn't matter anyway. I could see him losing faith not just in our legal fight, but in the idea that good things happen to good people, that standing up for yourself meant anything at all. The anger inside me was getting harder to control. I'd find myself snapping at classmates over nothing, getting into arguments with teachers who gave me sympathetic looks when they heard about our family troubles. I didn't want their pity. I wanted someone to acknowledge that what was happening to us was wrong, that the system was rigged against people who couldn't afford to play the same games as the wealthy. My mom kept us grounded through all of it. Every time I'd start ranting about how unfair everything was, she'd put her hands on my shoulders and remind me why we were fighting. "This isn't just about the money, Gail," she'd say. "This is about proving that they can't just take whatever they want from people. This is about making sure what they did to us doesn't happen to someone else." But I could see the toll it was taking on her too. The stress was aging her faster than the years should have. Her hair was going gray, lines were appearing around her eyes, and she'd developed this nervous habit of rubbing her wedding ring when she was thinking about the case. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, and sometimes I'd catch her staring off into space with an expression that looked like she was carrying the weight of the world. The worst moments came when well-meaning people would ask us why we didn't just let it go and move on with our lives. They'd say things like, "Is all this legal trouble really worth it? Wouldn't you be happier if you just focused on the future instead of dwelling on the past?" These people meant well, but they didn't understand that we weren't dwelling on anything. We were fighting for basic justice, for the right to say that what Walter and his family had done was wrong and should have consequences. After 3 years of legal battles, false starts, and betrayals, our case finally looked like it might actually make it to trial. Torres had managed to outmaneuver most of Cromwell's delay tactics, and we had a trial date that the judge seemed determined to stick to. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I started to believe that we might actually get our day in court, our chance to tell our story to a jury and let them decide who was telling the truth. But even then, even when victory seemed possible, Walter and Cromwell weren't finished with their games. They had one more strategy up their sleeves, one that would test our resolve in ways I never could have imagined. The day our case finally went to trial, I was 19 years old and felt like I'd aged a decade during those 3 years of legal warfare. My mom had barely slept the night before, and I found her in Roger's kitchen at 5 in the morning, sitting at the table with all of Papa's old documents spread out in front of her, going through them one more time like she was studying for the most important test of her life. Torres had prepared us as much as he could, explaining how the trial would work, what questions we might face, what kind of tactics Cromwell might use to discredit our testimony. But nothing could have prepared us for the emotional weight of walking into that courtroom and seeing Walter, Agnes, Leonard, and Beatrice sitting at the defendant's table for the first time in 3 years. They looked older, more tired than I remembered, but there was still this air of arrogance about them, like they couldn't quite believe they were actually being held accountable. Walter had aged the most. His hair had gone completely white, and he walked with a cane now, though I suspected that was partly for show. He wanted the jury to see him as a frail old man rather than someone capable of systematically defrauding his own family. Agnes sat beside him wearing a simple black dress, so different from the flashy jewelry and expensive clothes she'd worn to her earlier court appearances. They were playing the role of respectable elderly people who couldn't possibly have done anything as calculating as what we were accusing them of. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and every day felt like a lifetime. Torres did a masterful job of laying out our case, showing the jury exactly how Papa's businesses had been transferred to Walter's control, how the insurance money had disappeared into family accounts that my mom never had access to, how the legal documents my mom had signed were deliberately confusing and misrepresented what she was actually agreeing to. When my mom took the witness stand, I held my breath. She'd been dreading this moment for months, worried that she'd break down or forget important details or somehow not be believed. But when Torres asked her to tell the jury what had happened after Papa's funeral, something remarkable occurred. Her voice became steady and clear, and she told our story with a dignity that made me proud to be her daughter. She explained how Walter had come to our house while she was still numb with grief, how he'd pressured her into signing papers she didn't understand, how he'd promised to take care of us and then thrown us out of our home instead. When Torres showed her the documents she'd signed, she pointed out how the language was deliberately misleading, how Walter had assured her she was just giving him temporary authority to help manage Papa's affairs. "I trusted him," my mom said, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "He was my husband's father. I thought he wanted to protect my children the way Victor would have wanted. I never imagined he was planning to take everything Victor had worked for and leave us with nothing." Cromwell's cross-examination was brutal. He tried to make my mom look like she was lying, like she'd understood exactly what she was signing and was now trying to get out of legitimate business agreements. He brought up Papa's affair, suggesting that maybe my mom had reasons to want to distance herself from Papa's memory. He implied that she was an irresponsible mother who had squandered money and was now looking for someone else to blame for her financial problems. I watched my mom's knuckles turn white as she gripped the witness stand, but she never lost her composure. When Cromwell asked her why she hadn't sought legal advice before signing the papers, she looked directly at the jury and said, "Because I was a 26-year-old widow with 2 small children who had just lost the love of her life. I was barely functional, and the last person I expected to hurt us was my husband's own father." When it was my turn to testify, I told the jury about watching Walter laugh at Papa's funeral, about the way he'd stood over my mom while she signed those papers, about how our lives had changed overnight from stability to poverty. I described the years we'd spent watching Walter and his family live in luxury while we struggled to pay rent, the way they'd travel to exotic places and send postcards like we were all still one happy family. Cromwell tried to discredit me too, suggesting that I was too young to understand what I'd witnessed, that my memories might be distorted by years of resentment. But I'd been preparing for this moment my entire adolescence. I'd gone over every detail of those early days hundreds of times, and I spoke with the conviction of someone who had lived through hell and survived to tell the truth about it. The most powerful moment came when Torres presented evidence of how Walter's family had lived after Papa's death. He showed the jury bank records proving that Walter had deposited Papa's insurance money into his own accounts, business documents showing how Papa's companies had been transferred to Leonard's name, travel receipts and photographs from expensive vacations that had been funded by money that should have supported my mom, Ethan, and me. When Walter took the stand in his own defense, he tried to paint himself as a caring grandfather who had been trying to help his son's widow make responsible financial decisions. He claimed that Papa had been irresponsible with money, that the businesses were failing, that he'd only taken control to prevent everything from being lost to creditors and bad investments. But Torres was ready for him. He produced Papa's business records, showing that the companies had been profitable and growing right up until Papa's death. He presented evidence that Walter had immediately begun liquidating assets and transferring money to his own family members. Most damning of all, he showed that Walter had never once provided my mom with any accounting of how Papa's money was being spent or what had happened to the insurance payments. "Mr. Adams," Torres said during cross-examination, "if you were truly trying to help your daughter-in-law, why didn't you give her any documentation showing how her husband's money was being managed?" Walter fumbled for an answer, something about not wanting to burden her with complicated financial details. But his explanation sounded hollow even to me. The jury could see right through him. Leonard and Beatrice's testimony was equally unconvincing. They both claimed they'd just been following Walter's lead, that they'd never questioned his authority or his decisions about Papa's estate. But when Torres showed them evidence of expensive purchases they'd made using money from Papa's businesses, They couldn't explain why they'd felt entitled to spend funds that were supposed to be held in trust for Papa's widow and children. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they came back into the courtroom, I could tell from their faces what the verdict would be before the foreman even opened his mouth. They'd found Walter, Agnes, Leonard, and Beatrice guilty of fraud, conspiracy, and breach of fiduciary duty. They awarded us damages that included not just the money that had been stolen, but interest and penalties that had accumulated over the years. When the judge read the verdict, my mom started crying, not the desperate, hopeless tears I'd seen so many times over the years, but tears of relief and vindication. Ethan, who was 16 by then and had grown into this quiet, serious young man, actually smiled for the first time in months. I felt like I could finally breathe after holding my breath for 3 years. But even in that moment of triumph, I knew we weren't finished. Torres had warned us that winning the case was only half the battle. Actually collecting the money would be another fight entirely. Walter and his family had years to move assets around, hide money, and create obstacles to prevent us from getting what the court had awarded us. Torres was right. The execution phase of our case turned out to be almost as difficult as the trial itself. Walter immediately appealed the verdict, which meant we couldn't collect anything until the appeals process was finished. Cromwell filed motion after motion claiming that various assets were protected from seizure, that business accounts contained money belonging to other people, that the family's property was held in trust or otherwise couldn't be touched. Every month that passed was another month of Walter's family spending money they knew they'd eventually have to pay back to us. Another month of them liquidating assets and moving funds to places where we couldn't reach them. It was maddening to have won such a clear victory in court only to watch them continue playing games to avoid the consequences. But something fundamental had changed after that verdict. For the first time in my adult life, we had an official recognition that what had happened to us was wrong. A jury of 12 ordinary people had looked at the evidence and concluded that Walter and his family were thieves who had stolen from a widow and her children. That validation meant more to my mom than I think she'd expected it to. "They can delay paying us back," she told me one evening as we waited for news about the latest appeal, "but they can never change what that jury said about them. They can never undo the fact that their fraud has been proven in a court of law." The appeals process took another 18 months, but Walter's lawyers couldn't overturn the facts that Torres had established at trial. The appellate court upheld our verdict, though they reduced the penalty amounts slightly. More importantly, they rejected Walter's attempts to claim that various assets were protected from collection. When we finally started receiving payments, it felt surreal after so many years of poverty and struggle. The first check wasn't huge. Walter's lawyer had negotiated a payment plan that would stretch out over several years, but it represented something much more valuable than money. It represented the end of our powerlessness, the beginning of our ability to make choices about our lives instead of just surviving whatever happened to us. My mom used some of the money to leave Roger, something she'd wanted to do for years but hadn't been able to afford. She rented a small apartment that was just for the 3 of us, the first place we'd lived since Papa's death that felt like home. Ethan, who had been accepted to college but couldn't afford to go, was suddenly able to pursue the education he'd dreamed of. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the knowledge that we'd refused to let them win. We'd stood up to people who thought they could take whatever they wanted from us, and we'd proven them wrong. After 13 years of being told we were powerless, we'd shown that even ordinary people could fight back against injustice and win. Sitting here at 80, running my fingers over this old locket that belonged to my mom, I find myself thinking about the girl I was when this whole nightmare began. Gail Adams at 8 years old had no idea what was coming, had no way to prepare for the cruelty that people could show to children who had already lost so much. Walter died 12 years ago, and I felt nothing when Ethan called to tell me. No satisfaction, no relief, just this strange emptiness where anger used to live. Agnes followed him 2 years later, and Leonard passed just last winter. Sometimes I wonder if any of them ever felt guilt about the years they took from us. I still hear Walter's laugh sometimes, usually when I'm falling asleep. That sound, the sound of a man genuinely amused by his son's funeral. It marked the beginning of our real childhood ending. The betrayal still stings after all these years. Not the financial loss, But the realization that people who were supposed to love us could look at 2 grieving children and a broken widow and see nothing but opportunity. But if Walter taught me about the worst of human nature, my mom taught me about the best. Lila was 26 years old when Papa died, and she was thrown into circumstances that would have destroyed a weaker person. She made mistakes, trusting Walter, marrying Roger, but she never stopped fighting for Ethan and me. I think about the courage it took for her to file that lawsuit. She was a woman with no money, no connections, going up against people who had resources and experience. She knew they'd fight dirty, but she did it anyway because she understood that some things are more important than safety. Those years changed all of us. Ethan became quieter, more thoughtful, someone who doesn't trust easily. He went on to become a teacher, helping children who reminded him of himself. He married Sarah when he was 28, and they had 3 children who grew up knowing they were loved unconditionally. As for me, I became someone who doesn't back down from fights that matter, someone who reads every document carefully. I married Robert when I was 25, and I told him our whole story on our 3rd date because I needed to know if he was the kind of person who would stand by me if life got difficult again. Robert was solid in ways that mattered. We built a good life together. Nothing fancy, but stable and honest and filled with love I'd thought was lost forever after Papa died. We had 2 daughters, owned our home, put them through college. Every milestone felt like a victory over the people who had tried to keep us down. My mom lived to see both daughters graduate from college, lived to hold her first great-grandchild, lived to know that the family line Papa had worried about protecting had survived despite everything Walter's clan had done to us. She died peacefully at 74, and her last words to me were, "We did it, Gail. We showed them they couldn't break us." The money we recovered helped, but it never could give us back the years we'd lost. What mattered more was the knowledge that we'd refused to be victims forever, that we'd stood up and fought back even when the odds were stacked against us. Now, surrounded by pictures of children and grandchildren, I can see how far we traveled from that tiny apartment where my mom used to cry herself to sleep. The scar tissue from those early years never completely disappeared, but those scars also made me stronger, more grateful for genuine kindness when I encounter it. The strangest thing about getting old is how the past becomes both more distant and more vivid. I can remember the exact look in my mom's eyes when she realized she didn't have to accept what had been done to us. The way Walter's voice shook when he tried to explain why he'd never given my mom any accounting of Papa's money. Those memories aren't painful anymore. They've become part of a larger story about resilience, about the strength that ordinary people can find when they're pushed too far. I think Papa would be proud of how we turned out, proud of the way my mom fought for us, proud of the lives Ethan and I built despite the obstacles. The real victory wasn't the court case or the money. It was refusing to let their cruelty define us, refusing to become bitter and mean the way they were. That's the lesson I hope my descendants carry forward. That blood doesn't make family, that kindness and loyalty are what create the bonds that matter. If you're sitting somewhere right now dealing with people who've betrayed you or facing a legal system that seems designed to wear you down, I want you to hear this from someone who's been exactly where you are. You have more strength inside you than you realize. Keep every piece of paper, every email, every receipt. The smallest detail might be the thing that proves your case. Take photos of documents, make copies, store them in different places. The people trying to hurt you are counting on you being disorganized and overwhelmed. Finding a lawyer you can trust is harder than it should be. We went through 3 attorneys before we found Torres, and 2 of those betrayed us for money. Ask questions before you hire anyone. Find out who else they represent, ask for references, trust your instincts when something feels wrong. The delays will try to break your spirit. That's exactly what they're designed to do. Walter's lawyer knew that every month he could drag things out was another month of us struggling, another month closer to us giving up. Don't give them that satisfaction. Use the delays to gather more evidence to strengthen your case. You're not alone in this, even when it feels like the whole world has turned against you. There are people out there who understand what you're going through. Find them. Talk to them. Sometimes just knowing that someone else survived something similar can give you the strength to keep going. I've shared my story with you, from an 8-year-old girl who watched her grandfather laugh at her father's funeral to an 80-year-old woman who still believes in fighting for what's right. Now I want to hear from you. What's your story? What betrayal are you facing? What legal battle has you lying awake at night? Share it in the comments because someone else reading this might need to hear that they're not the only one going through something like this. Maybe you're dealing with family members who think they can take advantage of you. Maybe you're facing a legal system that seems rigged against ordinary people. Whatever it is, your story matters. Your fight matters. What's kept you fighting through your darkest days? Let's keep this conversation going. I'm so grateful you've listened to my story this far. It's not always easy revisiting these memories, but knowing that sharing them might help someone else find their way makes it completely worthwhile. I truly hope that what I've shared today isn't just a sad tale, but also a source of motivation. It's a reminder that no matter how difficult life becomes, there's always light at the end of the road. Always remember that strength lies within you, and hope is a flame that should never be put out. To help us keep spreading these meaningful stories, please support the Grandparents Archives channel by subscribing, liking this video, and sharing it with your loved ones. I want to sincerely thank the founder of Grandparents Archives for giving me this opportunity to share my experience. Stay tuned for more touching stories on the Grandparents Archives channel.